A reclusive millionaire returned to his ancestral estate on Christmas Eve, only to be paralyzed by the sight of a small child huddled in the snow against his locked gates. The boy was clutching a worn, hand-drawn map that seemed to lead directly to this very spot, a place he was clearly not welcome. Why would a child be left to freeze 100 miles from the nearest city? And what darkness had guided his small hands to draw a map to a stranger's door? The world had gone silent, smothered under a fresh blanket of white. Arthur Vance guided the Bentley up the long, winding drive, the crunch of tires on snow the only sound in the vast, muffled landscape. Flakes spiraled down in the headlight beams, hypnotic and relentless, erasing the world behind him. This was how he preferred it. Erased. The estate, Blackwood Manor, was more fortress than home. Its gray stone walls and iron-wrought gates designed to keep the world at a comfortable, sterile distance. Christmas was a season he endured, not celebrated. It was a ghost, a hollow echo in the grand, empty halls of his life, a reminder of a silence that had set in long ago and never truly left. He was a man made of quiet control and accumulated wealth, a fortress himself, and the holiday's forced cheer felt like a violation of his carefully constructed peace. The gates loomed ahead, a black iron grin in the falling snow. But something was wrong. A shape, a small, dark smudge against the ornate scrollwork, something that did not belong in the pristine geometry of his isolation. Arthur slowed the car, his hand tightening on the leather-wrapped wheel. His mind, always cataloging, always assessing, rejected the image. A deer, perhaps, fallen near the road. A pile of discarded refuse from a passing car. But as the headlights swept across the entrance, the shape resolved itself with horrifying clarity. It was a child. He stopped the car. His heart, a dormant, reliable machine, gave a painful clench. He cut the engine, and the sudden, profound silence of the snow-filled woods pressed in on him. For a moment, he just sat there, the heated interior of the luxury car a world away from the impossible tableau outside. The boy couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, a tiny figure in a coat far too thin for the biting December air. He wasn't crying or calling for help. He was simply huddled against the cold iron, his small body a study in resignation, as if he had arrived at his destination and was now merely waiting for the inevitable. A cold dread, colder than the winter air, seeped into Arthur's bones. This was an intrusion of the highest order, a raw, human problem deposited on the doorstep of a man who had spent 2 decades meticulously eliminating such things from his life. He pushed open the heavy door of the Bentley, the frigid air a physical slap. Snow crunched under his expensive leather shoes as he walked toward the gates, each step feeling unnaturally loud. The boy looked up as he approached, and his eyes were the most haunting thing Arthur had ever seen. They were wide and dark, and held not the simple fear of a lost child, but a deep, ancient terror, the kind Arthur had only seen in the eyes of soldiers who had witnessed unspeakable things. There was no hope in them, no expectation of rescue. He was simply observing a new threat. "Hello there," Arthur said, his voice sounding rough and unused in the stillness. It was the wrong thing to say, too casual for the gravity of the moment. The boy flinched, pulling himself tighter into a ball. Arthur stopped a few feet away, raising his hands slowly as if approaching a frightened animal. He crouched down, bringing himself to the child's level, ignoring the snow soaking through the knee of his tailored trousers. "Are you lost?" A stupid question. Of course he was lost. They were miles from anything. The boy just stared, his breath pluming in tiny, white clouds. In his small, mittened hand, he clutched a piece of paper. A napkin, Arthur realized, creased and worn. On it was a child's drawing, a crude map made of wobbly lines. A long, winding road. A drawing of a big, dark house with pointy roofs. And an X right at a drawing of a gate. Blackwood Manor. His gate. Arthur felt a disorienting wave of confusion. It wasn't just that the boy was here. It was that he had been sent here. This was not an accident. This was a message, a deliberate act of cruelty packaged in the small, shivering frame of a child. He looked at the boy again, really looked past the initial shock. He was a handsome child, with rich, dark skin that contrasted sharply with the falling snow and eyes that should have been full of life. But they were hollowed out. Under the thin coat, Arthur could see how painfully slender he was. A faint, purplish bruise peeked out from the cuff of his sleeve, a dark flower blooming on his wrist. A different feeling began to surface, pushing through the cold dread. It was an old, familiar anger, a low, protective burn he hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling that had driven him into the military and then out of it, the feeling he had tried to bury under layers of wealth and isolation. It was the rage of a protector who had just found something that desperately needed protecting. "It's cold," Arthur said softly, his voice different now, stripped of any pretense. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." He reached out slowly, not to touch the boy, but the gate. He pressed the remote in his pocket. With a low hum, the great iron gates began to swing inward, opening a path into the sanctuary he had built for himself. For the first time, an emotion flickered in the boy's eyes. Not hope, but a kind of bewildered surprise, as if the world had just violated a fundamental rule. He watched the gates open, then looked back at Arthur, a silent question in his gaze. Arthur offered his hand. The boy stared at it for a long moment before, with visible hesitation. He placed his small, cold hand into Arthur's much larger one. His touch was feather-light, fragile. As Arthur led him toward the waiting warmth of the car, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that this child was not just a problem to be solved. He was a responsibility to be met, and the carefully constructed silence of Arthur Vance's life had just been irrevocably shattered. The interior of Blackwood Manor was as silent as the snow-covered grounds, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of wealth and solitude, a quiet held in the high, vaulted ceilings, the dark wood paneling, and the portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow you. For the boy, it must have been like stepping into a giant's castle. Arthur led him into the great hall, where a massive stone fireplace stood cold and empty. He had long since dismissed the staff for the holidays, preferring the perfect stillness of being utterly alone. Now that stillness felt wrong, accusing. He knelt and began to gently unbutton the boy's thin coat. The child stood perfectly still, rigid with a learned compliance that broke Arthur's heart. Underneath, he wore a thin sweater and jeans, clothes wholly inadequate for the weather. As the coat came off, Arthur saw them more clearly. The bruises, not just the one on his wrist, but another on his upper arm, the distinct, ugly shape of a handprint. They were old, faded to a sickly yellow-green, but undeniable. He drew in a sharp, quiet breath, the protective rage inside him sharpening to a fine, cold point. He wrapped the boy in a thick cashmere throw from a nearby sofa, the fabric absurdly luxurious against the child's worn clothing. The boy sank into its warmth, a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaping his lips. "I'm Arthur," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "What's your name?" The boy looked at him, his dark eyes fathomless, but said nothing. He didn't seem unwilling to speak. He seemed unable, as if the words were locked away in a place he couldn't reach. Arthur didn't press. He understood that silence could be a shield. He had used it as one himself for years. He led the boy into the kitchen, a vast, stainless steel affair that was more commercial grade than domestic. It was sterile and unused, but it was functional. He sat the boy on a stool at the large island and set about making him something warm. He found a can of tomato soup in the pantry, a relic from a long-forgotten grocery order. As he worked, he could feel the child's eyes on him, tracking his every move with a wary intensity. He moved slowly, deliberately, making his actions predictable and non-threatening. When the soup was ready, he poured it into a bowl and placed it on the island with a piece of bread. The boy stared at it, then at Arthur, as if waiting for permission, or perhaps for the other shoe to drop. "It's for you," Arthur said gently. "Go ahead." Hesitantly, the boy picked up the spoon. He ate with a desperate, frantic hunger, yet with a strange neatness, as if he were afraid of making a mess. He didn't spill a drop. He ate until the bowl was clean. Then he looked at Arthur, a flicker of fear in his eyes, as if he expected to be punished for his appetite. Arthur simply took the bowl and placed it in the sink. He looked back at the boy, at the small, guarded face, and in that fragile frame, he saw a hauntingly familiar reflection of a past he thought he had buried long ago. He saw vulnerability, the kind he had once failed to protect. A promise he had broken to someone else a lifetime ago. A ghost whispered in his ear, a memory of another small hand he had failed to hold on to. He would not fail again. In that moment, surrounded by the cold, gleaming emptiness of his own life, Arthur Vance made a quiet, internal vow. It was not a grand or dramatic proclamation, but a simple, unbreakable promise forged in the cold fire of his newfound rage. "I will find who did this to you," he promised the silent child. "I will uncover the truth, and I will make them answer for it. I will keep you safe." He would become the fortress this child so clearly needed. After the boy had eaten, Arthur took him upstairs to one of the many guest bedrooms. The room was opulent, with a 4-poster bed and silk wallpaper, a place of absurd comfort. He found a pair of his own soft pajamas, which would be ridiculously large on the boy, but warm. As he helped the child change, a small, worn teddy bear fell from the pocket of his jeans. It was missing an eye and one of its ears was torn, but the boy snatched it up with a panicked urgency, clutching it to his chest. It was an anchor, a piece of his history. Arthur recognized it as a totem of survival. Once the boy was settled in the enormous bed, tucked under a heavy down comforter, Arthur returned to the great hall, the child's discarded clothes in his hand. He went through the pockets carefully. There was nothing but the napkin map and a single crumpled sweet wrapper. He smoothed the napkin out on the grand mahogany table. On one side was the map to his house, the word "safe" written in shaky, childlike letters near the drawing of the manor. He flipped it over. The other side held another drawing. It was a picture of a stick-figure woman with long, flowing hair and a wide, smiling mouth filled with jagged, sharp teeth, like a shark. Next to her was a smaller stick figure, presumably the boy, cowering. It was a portrait of a monster. A profound and chilling realization washed over Arthur. The boy hadn't just been abandoned. He had been psychologically tormented. Someone had drawn a map to a stranger's house, called it safe, and sent him out into a blizzard, all while convincing him that the person who was supposed to care for him was a monster. This was a game of unimaginable cruelty. He stood there for a long time, the drawing illuminated by a single lamp in the vast, dark room. The silence of the house pressed in, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of the small, sleeping child upstairs. It was filled with Arthur's cold, righteous fury, and it was filled with his purpose. He had spent years building walls to keep the world out. Now, he would use those walls to protect one small part of it. He would use his fortune, his resources, his own broken past, as weapons. The hunt had begun. The first step was to find out who this child was, and who his monster was. The quiet hum of the manor's heating system was the only sound for hours. Arthur sat in his study, a room lined with books he never read, nursing a glass of whiskey he didn't taste. He had called the local sheriff's department, a small, rural outfit and used to dealing with anything more than loose livestock or speeding tickets. He reported a found child, giving his address but keeping the details intentionally sparse. He knew that the moment he involved the authorities, he would begin to lose control of the situation, and control was something he would not relinquish. He needed to arm himself with information before anyone else could spin a narrative. He had also made another call to Marcus Thorne, his head of security. Marcus was more than a guard. He was a former military intelligence officer, a man who could find a whisper in a hurricane. Arthur had tasked him with the impossible. Find out who the boy was with nothing more than a vague description and the county where he was found. As the first pale hints of Christmas morning light began to filter through the tall, arched windows, casting long shadows across the room, Arthur heard a soft sound from the hallway. He looked up to see the boy standing in the doorway, clutching his one-eyed bear, a small, lost figure engulfed in Arthur's silk pajamas. He wasn't crying, he was just watching. Arthur beckoned him in. The boy padded silently across the thick Persian rug and stood beside his chair. Arthur picked up the crude drawing from his desk, the one of the monster. He kept his movements slow, his voice gentle. "Did you draw this?" he asked. The boy looked at the drawing and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Arthur pointed to the shark-toothed woman. "Who is this?" The boy flinched. He physically recoiled, taking a step back, his knuckles white where he gripped the teddy bear. He shook his head violently, not in negation, but in fear. It was a clear, unvoiced plea not to make him speak of it. Arthur had his answer. This was the source of his terror. He put the drawing down. He would not push him. The child's trauma was a locked room, and he would not kick down the door. He would wait for the boy to hand him the key. An hour later, headlights swept across the front of the manor. A sleek, black SUV crunched to a halt on the gravel drive. It wasn't the sheriff's cruiser Arthur had been expecting. A woman emerged, tall and elegant even in her distress. She wore a cream-colored cashmere coat, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the panic she was clearly trying to project. She ran to the door, her face a mask of practiced maternal anguish. Arthur met her in the foyer. "Thank God," she breathed, placing a hand over her heart. "I've been out of my mind. I'm Isabella Thorne, Leo's mother. The police called me." Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. "Leo." The boy had a name. "He's safe," Arthur said, his tone flat and uninviting. "Leo, darling," Isabella called out, pushing past Arthur as if he were a doorman. Leo, who had been peering out from the study, froze at the sound of her voice. He didn't run to her. He shrank back into the shadows of the doorway, his small body trembling. Isabella's perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recalibrated. She rushed to him, scooping him up in an embrace that looked more like a capture. Leo went rigid in her arms. "Oh, my poor, troubled boy," she cooed, stroking his hair. She turned to Arthur, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you so much for finding him. He has these episodes. He gets overwhelmed and he just runs. We've been looking for a specialist. His father's passing was so hard on him. It was a masterful performance. Plausible. Heartbreaking. A complete and utter lie. Arthur could feel the falsehood of it. A cold, slick layer of deceit coating her every word. He looked from her desperate, loving expression to the stark terror in Leo's eyes. The contrast was a chasm. "He had a map," Arthur stated, his voice dangerously quiet. It led him here. Isabella's expression shifted to one of profound sadness. "He does that. He draws these fantasy maps. He told his therapist he was looking for a safe castle. He must have seen your house from the road once. I am so sorry for the intrusion. We were on our way to my parents' home for the holiday when I realized he was gone." She was good. She was very, very good. She had an explanation for everything. A story that painted her as the loving, struggling mother of a difficult child. She was gaslighting him, using the boy's trauma as her shield. The first twist of the knife. This wasn't a simple case of neglect. It was a campaign of sophisticated cruelty waged by a predator hiding in plain sight. "Given the weather and the circumstances," Arthur said, his decision solidifying, "I think it's best if the sheriff's department completes a full report before he goes anywhere. I've asked them to send a child welfare officer as well." Just a formality. Isabella's eyes flashed with a brief, hot anger before the mask of concern slipped back into place. "Of course," she said, her voice tight. Whatever is necessary. She knew she was caught, for the moment. To protest would be to admit guilt. She set Leo down, and the boy immediately scrambled to hide behind Arthur's legs. A silent, damning indictment of her story. She pretended not to notice. As they waited, the air in the grand hall was thick with unspoken tension. Isabella paced, periodically dabbing at her dry eyes, while Arthur stood like a statue, a silent sentinel with a small boy clinging to his trousers. He now knew the monster's name. It was Isabella, and he knew his vow was no longer just a feeling. It was a plan. The lie had been presented. Now he would dismantle it piece by piece. The arrival of Sheriff Brody and a social worker named Ms. Albright shifted the dynamic in the room. Brody was a man weathered by decades of small-town life, his skepticism a default setting. Ms. Albright was younger, her expression a careful blend of compassion and professional detachment. Isabella immediately launched into her performance, recounting her story with heartbreaking detail, her voice cracking at all the right moments. She was the grieving widow, the devoted stepmother, the frantic parent. She painted Leo as a deeply imaginative but troubled child, prone to flights of fancy and running away. Arthur remained silent, letting her build her own cage of lies. He watched Ms. Albright, who was watching Leo. The boy had not left Arthur's side. He was a silent, powerful counter-narrative to Isabella's monologue. When she had finished, Ms. Albright knelt down to Leo's level. "Hello, Leo," she said softly. "My name is Sarah. That's a very brave bear you have there." Leo clutched the bear tighter but didn't respond. He just watched her, his eyes wide and assessing. Sheriff Brody turned to Arthur. "Mr. Vance, you found him at your gate?" "That's correct," Arthur said. "Around 10 p.m. last night. He was freezing and had this." He handed the sheriff the napkin map. Brody examined it, his brow furrowed. "He had a map to your house?" "It would seem so," Arthur said, his gaze flicking to Isabella, who wore an expression of pained resignation, as if to say, "See what I have to deal with?" The official process was slow and frustrating. Without a clear statement from Leo or obvious signs of fresh injury, Isabella's story, however implausible to Arthur, was difficult to disprove on the spot. Legally, she was his guardian. But Ms. Albright was sharp. The boy's refusal to go near Isabella, his catatonic fear, was a significant red flag. She made a decision. Given the conflicting accounts and Leo's nonverbal state, she announced, "I'm recommending a 72-hour hold. Leo will be placed in temporary foster care while we investigate." It's standard procedure to ensure the child's immediate safety. Isabella's composure finally cracked. "Foster care? That's absurd. He needs to be with his mother. He needs to be in a neutral environment until we can ascertain what happened." Ms. Albright countered, her tone firm. Compromise was reached. Leo would not go with Isabella, but he wouldn't be thrown into the unfamiliar trauma of a stranger's foster home either. After a tense, private conversation where Arthur's lawyers may have been mentioned, it was agreed that Leo could remain at Blackwood Manor, with Ms. Albright making daily visits, until the situation was resolved. It was an unconventional arrangement, but Arthur Vance was an unconventional man, and his resources spoke volumes. Isabella left in a fury, her mask of maternal grief replaced by a cold, reptilian anger. The moment her car was gone, Leo, who had been a statue of tension, seemed to wilt, a long, shuddering breath escaping his small body. The immediate threat was gone. Now Arthur's real work could begin. While Leo was safe under his roof, Arthur knew Isabella would be working to reclaim him, to bury the truth forever. He had a 72-hour window. He retreated to his study and called Marcus. "I have a name," Arthur said. "Isabella Thorne. And the boy's name is Leo. His father was Michael Thorne. He's deceased. I want to know everything. Neighbors, finances, Michael's death, school records. Everything. I want a complete picture of her life." "On it," Marcus replied, his voice a calm promise of efficiency. But Arthur couldn't just wait. His instincts told him the answers weren't just in databases. They were in the world Isabella had built. He needed to see it, to breathe the air of it. Leaving Leo in the capable hands of his housekeeper, Mrs. Penny, whom he'd called back from her holiday for this emergency, Arthur drove away from the sanctuary of his estate and back into the world he despised. He went to the address Marcus had found for the Thornes, a pristine house in a sterile, upscale suburban development. It was the kind of place where perfection was a currency, where every lawn was manicured and every secret was kept behind a freshly painted door. He didn't approach the house. He just watched from a distance. Then he did what wealthy men rarely do. He walked. He walked down the quiet, snow-dusted street, looking for a crack in the facade. He found it 3 doors down. An elderly woman was struggling to bring a trash receptacle up her icy driveway. Arthur helped her. Her name was Mrs. Gable. "Thank you, young man," she said, her breath fogging in the cold. "A bit of a struggle these days." "My pleasure," Arthur said. "I'm new to the area, just looking around. It seems like a very quiet, family-friendly neighborhood." Mrs. Gable's friendly expression tightened. "Mostly," she said, her gaze drifting toward the Thorne house. "Mostly quiet." Arthur sensed the opening. "That house is beautiful," he said, nodding toward it. "Does a family live there?" "A woman, Isabella, and her boy Leo," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Her husband passed a few months back. A terrible accident." There was a hesitation in her voice, a reluctance that spoke volumes. Arthur waited. "Such a sweet boy, Leo," she continued. Her eyes clouded with a worry she was trying to hide. "Quiet. Very quiet. Too quiet, if you ask me." She leaned in a little, her voice conspiratorial. "I don't see him outside much. Not since his father. Not since the accident. And Isabella, she has a temper. I've heard her shouting. Things a person shouldn't say to a child." The reluctant witness. She was afraid of Isabella, afraid of getting involved. "Did you see them leave yesterday?" Arthur asked, his voice casual. Mrs. Gable wrung her hands. "I did. Saw her pull out of the driveway in the afternoon. All packed up for the holidays, I suppose." "Was Leo with her?" Arthur asked the crucial question. Mrs. Gable paused, her eyes distant as she recalled the memory. "No," she said, her voice firm with certainty. "No, he wasn't. I thought it was strange. I remember thinking, she's leaving the boy with a sitter on Christmas Eve? But I didn't see anyone else come or go." It was the first external piece of evidence, the first stone to dislodge the foundation of Isabella's lie. She had left the house alone. She had lied to the police. She had lied to him. Mrs. Gable looked nervous, as if she had said too much. "I should get inside. It's cold." "Thank you for your help," Arthur said. "You've been very kind." He walked back to his car, the conversation replaying in his mind. He now had a witness, however reluctant. He had a timeline that contradicted Isabella's. The edges of the truth were beginning to emerge from the fog of deception. Back at the manor, he found Leo in the library, a room as big as a small house. He wasn't looking at the books. He was sitting on the floor with a box of crayons and a stack of paper Arthur had left for him. He was drawing. Arthur watched him from the doorway, his heart aching. The boy was meticulously drawing a house. It was the house from the suburbs, the one Arthur had just seen. But in the drawing, something was different. One of the bedroom windows was colored in completely black, and the door to that room had a large, heavy padlock drawn on the outside. A locked door, a recurring symbol. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He was looking at a map of a prison. The next 48 hours were a blur of methodical, relentless investigation. Arthur operated with the precision of a surgeon, dissecting Isabella Thorne's life while simultaneously creating a cocoon of safety around Leo. He instructed Mrs. Penny to fill the cold manor with the smells of baking and warm food, to make the vast, empty spaces feel, for the first time, like a home. He spent hours with Leo, not asking questions, but simply being present. They sat by the fire, the first fire Arthur had lit in years, and built elaborate structures out of wooden blocks. Leo remained silent, but his fear began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity. He would watch Arthur intently, his dark eyes tracking every gesture, as if trying to understand this strange, quiet giant who had appeared in his life. He started leaving his drawings for Arthur to find. A drawing of the one-eyed bear, a drawing of a bird he saw outside the window, and always another drawing of the house with the locked room. It was his nonverbal testimony, a story he was telling in the only way he knew how. Meanwhile, Marcus was a phantom, moving through databases and digital back alleys. His reports came in hourly, each one a new piece of the damning puzzle. Michael Thorne, Leo's father, had been a brilliant software engineer who had recently sold his company for a fortune. He had married Isabella, a former model 20 years his junior, just 2 years prior. His death, a single-car accident on a clear night, had been ruled accidental, but Marcus found a troubling detail. The car's onboard diagnostics, which he accessed through a contact in the auto industry, showed no signs of mechanical failure or sudden braking. It was as if the car had simply drifted off the road. More damningly, just 1 week before his death, Michael had visited his lawyer to amend his will. The original document left his entire fortune in a trust for Leo. The new will left everything, unconditionally, to Isabella. The lawyer's notes, which Marcus managed to obtain, described Michael as being distressed and under duress, stating that he felt pressured by his wife. It was a motive clean and sharp. The money. Leo was not just an inconvenience. He was an obstacle to a vast inheritance. Arthur felt the cold certainty of it settle in his gut. This woman was capable of anything. But motive and circumstantial evidence were not enough. Isabella was clever. She would paint Arthur as a meddling billionaire trying to steal her son. He needed something undeniable, something that would utterly destroy her credibility. He needed a smoking gun. The answer, he knew, was in the house with the locked room. He stared at Leo's drawings, spread across the polished surface of his desk. The lock was always the most detailed part of the picture, drawn with heavy, dark crayon strokes. It was the focal point of his trauma. "Marcus," Arthur said into the phone, his voice low, "I need you to get a judge to sign a warrant for a wellness check on the Thorne residence. Cite the neighbor's testimony, the suspicious will, and the child's drawings as evidence of potential endangerment. I don't care what it takes. I need someone inside that house." It was a long shot, but Arthur's legal team was the best in the country. Within hours, citing the extraordinary circumstances and the Vance name, a sympathetic judge signed the order. Sheriff Brody, his own suspicions now thoroughly aroused, agreed to execute it himself. Arthur waited, pacing the length of his study, the tension in him a tightly coiled spring. The phone rang. It was Brody. "You were right, Mr. Vance," the sheriff said, his voice grim. "We're here now. The kid's room. It's exactly like the drawing. There's a heavy-duty bolt lock on the outside of his bedroom door. The closet door, too. The inside of the closet door it's covered in scratch marks." Arthur closed his eyes, the image searing itself into his mind. He could almost hear the sound of a small child scratching, alone in the dark. "Is there anything else?" Arthur asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Yeah," Brody said, a note of disbelief in his tone. "Something you're gonna want to see. My deputy found it inside a stuffed animal on the bed. A teddy bear with a missing eye. It's a nanny cam, still active. We're pulling the footage from the cloud server now, the one-eyed bear. Leo's anchor. It hadn't just been a comfort object. It had been a witness. A silent guardian his father had left behind." Marcus, with his own formidable tech skills, was patched into the police feed. An hour later, a file arrived in Arthur's secure inbox. He opened it, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He sat there for a full hour watching the unthinkable. The video was a montage of casual domestic horror. It showed Isabella's public face melting away the moment she was alone with Leo. There was footage of her screaming at him for spilling a drop of juice, her voice a venomous hiss. There were clips of her locking him in the dark closet for hours at a time, ignoring his soft cries. There were scenes of her withholding meals, placing a plate of food in front of him only to take it away, telling him monsters don't deserve to eat. But the final video file, dated Christmas Eve, was the most chilling of all. It showed Isabella in the car, Leo strapped into his car seat. She was holding the napkin map, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights. Her voice was cold, devoid of all emotion, as she coached him. "When they find you, you tell them you ran away," she said, tapping the map. "You tell them you were looking for the safe house. Because you're a bad boy, Leo. A little monster. And no one will ever believe a monster." She then pulled over on a dark, desolate road, unbuckled his seatbelt, and pushed him out into the snow. "Go on," she said, her voice flat. "Go find your castle." The video ended with the sight of the car's red taillights disappearing into the swirling snow, leaving a small, solitary figure standing alone on the side of the road. Arthur stared at the black screen, his breathing shallow. The rage he felt was so pure, so absolute, it was almost silent. It was a white-hot fire that burned away everything else. He had it, the undeniable, soul-destroying truth. He had the weapon. Now he just needed to find the right time and place to use it. He saved the file, his movements precise and calm. He had her. He would not just bring her to justice. He would utterly and completely dismantle the world of lies she had so carefully constructed around herself. He would do it for the little boy sleeping peacefully upstairs, the boy who had no idea that his silent witness had finally found its voice. With the damning evidence secured, the next phase of Arthur's plan required a different kind of weapon. The law. He summoned his personal attorney, Evelyn Reed, to the manor. Evelyn was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a reputation for being as compassionate in her private life as she was ruthless in the courtroom. She arrived within the hour, her expression serious. Arthur didn't waste time with pleasantries. He led her to his study and, without a word, played the video footage from the nanny cam. Evelyn watched, her professional composure slowly eroding with each clip. She was a seasoned lawyer who had seen the worst of humanity, but the calculated, psychological cruelty Isabella inflicted on Leo visibly shook her. When the final clip ended, the one showing the abandonment on the side of the road, she took a slow, deep breath and removed her glasses, polishing them with a piece of silk from her pocket. It was a small, telling gesture of her profound disturbance. "My God," she whispered, her voice tight with a fury that mirrored Arthur's own. "This is one of the most evil things I have ever seen." "The police have it," Arthur said. "They have enough to arrest her for endangerment, abuse, neglect, and she'll get a high-priced lawyer," Evelyn countered, her mind already several steps ahead. "She'll claim she was under stress, a grieving widow at her breaking point. She'll plead temporary insanity. Her legal team will try to bury this in court for years, painting Leo as an unreliable witness, a troubled child just as she planned. She'll get a slap on the wrist and be out in a year if she even serves time at all. That is not an acceptable outcome," Arthur stated, his voice a low growl. "No," Evelyn agreed, her eyes hard. "It is not. A quiet arrest isn't enough for a woman like this. She thrives on her public image, on the perception of her as a victim and a philanthropist. To truly deliver justice, we can't just put her in a cell. We have to destroy the lie she lives by. We have to expose her for what she is, in a way that is so public and so absolute that she can never recover." Arthur listened, a grim understanding dawning. Evelyn was right. Isabella's power was her facade. They had to shatter it in front of the very people she sought to impress. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. Evelyn's lips curved into a grim, determined line. "I did some research on the drive over. On Saturday night, Isabella Thorne is scheduled to be the guest of honor at the St. Jude's Children's Hospital Charity Gala. It's the biggest philanthropic event of the year. She's being given an award for her generous contributions and her devotion to children's welfare. The hypocrisy is staggering. The setting was perfect. A stage. An audience of the city's most powerful and influential people. The media. It was the arena where Isabella felt most powerful, most in control. It would be the site of her spectacular downfall. "We will let her walk onto that stage," Evelyn said, her voice laced with cold iron. "We will let her accept her award and give her speech. And then, when she is at the absolute pinnacle of her fraudulent life, we will burn it all to the ground." The plan was audacious, theatrical, and brutal. It was perfect. They spent the next hour meticulously planning the logistics. Evelyn would coordinate with the district attorney's office and Sheriff Brody. They would have officers waiting discreetly at the venue. Marcus would handle the technical side, ensuring he could gain control of the ballroom's audiovisual systems at the precise moment. Arthur's role was simple but crucial. He would be the one to deliver the final blow. While they planned, Leo was having his daily visit with Ms. Albright, the social worker. Arthur and Evelyn paused their war council to observe them from the doorway of the library. Leo was showing her his drawings, pointing to the different elements. He still wasn't speaking in full sentences, but with Ms. Albright's gentle prompting, he was beginning to whisper single words. "House," he said, pointing to the drawing of the suburban prison. "Lock." Then he pointed to the jagged-toothed woman. He hesitated, a shadow of fear crossing his face. He looked over at Arthur, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Leo took a breath and whispered the name, Bella. It was the first time he had named his tormentor. Ms. Albright wrote it down, her expression grim. She had seen enough. Her official report would recommend the immediate and permanent removal of Leo from Isabella's custody, and that she be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. All the pieces were falling into place. The legal system was moving. The allies were secured. The evidence was irrefutable, and the stage was being set. Arthur felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. His life, which had been a long, gray expanse of accumulating wealth and managing emptiness, now had a singular, righteous purpose. He was no longer just a protector. He was an avenger. He would be the instrument of justice for a little boy who had been silenced, and he would ensure that the whole world heard his story. The quiet, stoic millionaire and the silent, traumatized child were an unlikely team, but together, they were about to bring down a monster. Isabella Thorne, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around her, was growing bolder. Her 72-hour window was closing, and she believed the lack of immediate action from the authorities was a sign of their weakness, not their strategy. She saw Arthur Vance not as a threat, but as an obstacle, an eccentric old man who could be bullied into submission. Her lawyers, a team of aggressive corporate litigators, sent a formal, threatening letter to the manor. It was filled with blustering legal jargon, accusing Arthur of unlawful imprisonment of a minor, emotional distress, and custodial interference. It demanded the immediate return of Leo to her care, threatening a lawsuit that would tarnish the Vance name for generations. Arthur read the letter and tossed it into the fire, watching the paper curl and blacken into ash. It was the desperate gambit of a woman who believed she still held all the cards. Her arrogance was her greatest weakness. She then escalated her campaign to the public sphere. She granted an exclusive, tearful interview to a local television news station, which aired on the evening news. The setting was her immaculate living room, photos of a smiling Michael and a young Leo strategically placed in the background. With perfect poise and a voice trembling with feigned emotion, she wove a masterful tale of woe. "I am a mother in agony," she began, dabbing a silk handkerchief at her perfectly dry eyes. "My little boy, my precious Leo, who has been so lost since his father's tragic death, has been taken in by a reclusive and powerful man who refuses to let me see him. Mr. Vance may believe he is acting in my son's best interest, but he is a stranger. Leo needs his mother. I just want my baby home." She portrayed herself as the victim, a grieving widow being tormented by an overzealous billionaire. She hinted at Arthur's reclusive nature, subtly painting him as an unstable eccentric. It was a calculated move to seize control of the narrative, to poison the well of public opinion before any official charges could be filed. She was putting him on trial in the court of public opinion, confident she would win. Arthur watched the broadcast in his study, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Penny, who was clearing away his dinner tray, tooted at the television. "The nerve of that woman," she muttered. Lying to the whole world, Arthur simply nodded. "Let her," he said, his voice calm. "Let her climb as high as she can. It will only make the fall that much harder." Her public countermove, intended to intimidate him and pressure the authorities, was, in fact, a gift. She was reinforcing her public persona as a loving mother and philanthropist, making the coming revelation all the more shocking and devastating. She was drawing the battle lines exactly where Evelyn Reed had predicted, setting the stage for a public execution of her character. Every lie she told on television was another nail she was hammering into her own coffin. The interview had its intended effect on the public. Phone calls flooded the sheriff's department. Editorials were written questioning the overreach of Child Protective Services. Isabella was garnering sympathy, just as she had planned. She felt the tide turning in her favor. She felt secure, powerful and untouchable. On the morning of the charity gala, she sent one final, arrogant text message directly to Arthur's personal number, which her lawyers had obtained. "The whole city is on my side. You can't win. Bring Leo to the gala tonight and we can put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us. Do the right thing." Arthur read the message and deleted it without replying. The time for communication was over. The time for consequences was at hand. He went to find Leo, who was in the sunroom, watching the snow fall outside. The boy had started to relax in the quiet safety of the manor. A hint of color had returned to his cheeks, and the haunted, terrified look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet watchfulness. Arthur sat beside him. He knew that what he was about to do was for Leo, but he also worried about exposing the boy to such a public and traumatic event. He had discussed it at length with Evelyn and Ms. Albright. They agreed that Leo's presence, if handled carefully, could be the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. It was a risk, but a necessary one. He needed to give Leo a chance to face his monster from a position of power, surrounded by protection. "Leo," Arthur said gently, "tonight, we are going to make sure Bella can never hurt you, or anyone else, ever again. It might be a little loud, and there will be a lot of people, but I will be with you the entire time. You will be completely safe." Leo looked at him, his expression serious. He seemed to understand, on a level deeper than words, the gravity of what Arthur was saying. He didn't speak, but he reached out a small hand and placed it on Arthur's arm. It was a gesture of complete and utter trust. It was all the confirmation Arthur needed. The antagonist had made her move. Now it was his turn. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was a glittering spectacle of manufactured compassion. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto hundreds of guests in tuxedos and evening gowns, their laughter and conversation a low, self-congratulatory hum. It was a room full of people who wrote checks to feel good about themselves, a perfect audience for a predator like Isabella Thorne. She was the star of the evening, moving through the crowd with an ethereal grace, accepting compliments on her beauty and condolences for her loss. She wore a stunning, silver-sequined gown, looking every bit the tragic, beautiful philanthropist. She was radiant, confident, and completely unaware that she was a dead woman walking. At precisely 9 o'clock, she was called to the stage to receive the Guardian Angel Award. The applause was thunderous. She accepted the crystal statuette, her smile a mixture of humility and triumph. She stepped up to the podium, the ballroom falling silent in anticipation of her speech. "Thank you," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all for this incredible honor. But the honor truly is just being able to help the most vulnerable among us, our children. As a mother myself, I know there is no calling more sacred, no duty more profound, than to protect the innocence of a child." The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost breathtaking. She spoke for several minutes, weaving a beautiful tapestry of lies about her devotion to Leo, her heartbreak over her husband's death, and her commitment to helping less fortunate children. She was captivating. The audience was eating out of the palm of her hand. As she delivered her final, poignant line, "For every child deserves a safe harbor, a place to call home," the applause began to swell again. But it was cut short. From the back of the ballroom, the main doors opened, and a figure stepped inside. A hush fell over the room as every head turned to see. It was Arthur Vance. He was a phantom, a legend in the city, a man so reclusive that most people had never seen him in person. His presence was an immediate and shocking disruption. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored dark suit, and he moved with a calm, deliberate purpose, walking down the central aisle toward the stage. He was not hurried. He was not angry. He was an inevitability. Isabella's perfect smile tightened. Her eyes, which a moment ago were filled with false humility, now glinted with annoyance and a flicker of unease. She held up a hand to the stunned audience, a gesture of patronizing control. "Mr. Vance," she said into the microphone, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that failed to mask her irritation. "What an unexpected surprise. The press is here, you know. Have you come to make a grand gesture? Perhaps to finally return my son?" Arthur stopped at the foot of the stage, his gaze locking with hers. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was amplified by the room's stunned silence and carried with absolute authority. "I have come to return your son's story, Isabella," he said, his tone flat and cold. "And I've come to show these good people the truth you hide behind your checkbook and your crocodile tears." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Isabella laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. "I have no idea what you're talking about. You're clearly unwell." "Security!" she called out, her composure beginning to fray. But before any security guards could react, the two enormous screens on either side of the stage, which had been displaying the logo of the children's hospital, flickered and changed. An image appeared, the interior of a child's bedroom. The footage from the nanny cam began to play. The raw, unfiltered audio filled the silent ballroom. The guests watched, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock to horror, as they saw Isabella Thorne, their guardian angel, screaming at a small, terrified child. They heard her call him a monster. They saw her lock him in a dark closet. The glittering facade of the evening was being sledgehammered into dust. Isabella stared at the screens, her face draining of all color. "No," she whispered, her voice a strangled rasp. "No, this is fake. It's doctored." But the footage was too raw, too real. The final clip began to play. The scene in the car on Christmas Eve. The entire ballroom heard her cold, methodical coaching. "Tell them you ran away. No one will ever believe a monster." They watched in sickening silence as she pushed the little boy out of her car and drove away, abandoning him in a snowstorm. When the screens went black, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with disgust and judgment. Isabella stood frozen on the stage, exposed, her beautiful lies stripped away to reveal the ugly, rotten core of her soul. Her public mask, her entire identity, had been incinerated in the space of 3 minutes. The second twist had landed. Her carefully constructed world was in ruins. But Arthur was not finished. The evidence had broken her, but the final blow had to come from the truth itself. From the back of the room, a small voice, hesitant but clear, cut through the silence. "She's the monster." Every person turned. There, standing just inside the doorway, was Leo. He was holding the hand of Mrs. Gable, his reluctant witness, who had agreed to come to offer him a familiar, comforting presence. Leo took a tentative step forward, his eyes fixed on the woman on the stage. He was no longer the terrified, silent victim. His face was set with a child's simple, profound resolve. He pointed a small, steady finger at Isabella. "She locked the door," he said, his voice growing stronger. It was a simple, devastatingly honest testimony. It was the truth, delivered from the mouth of the one person she had tried so hard to silence. That was the moment Isabella Thorne finally, completely shattered. Her breakdown was not a pathetic, weeping confession. It was a volcanic eruption of pure, narcissistic rage. "He's lying," she shrieked, her voice a shrill, ugly thing. "The little brat is lying. He was a weight. He ruined everything. He was my husband's mistake, and he was supposed to be gone." She had confessed. In her rage, she had admitted to everything, her true nature exposed for all the world to see. Her social ruin was absolute and immediate. As her tirade devolved into incoherent screaming, 2 uniformed police officers, who had been waiting discreetly by the exits, walked calmly onto the stage. They didn't rush. They approached her with a quiet finality. "Isabella Thorne," one of them said, his voice calm but firm, "you are under arrest for child abuse, reckless endangerment, and kidnapping." She stared at them, her eyes wide with disbelief, before she finally collapsed, a storm of impotent fury and self-pity. As they led her away in handcuffs, past the hundreds of horrified faces of the people who had adored her just minutes before, Arthur walked to Leo. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around the small boy, shielding him from the cameras that were now flashing, creating a safe harbor in the middle of the storm he had unleashed. Justice had been served. The downfall of Isabella Thorne was as swift as it was brutal. The events of the charity gala became an immediate media firestorm. The nanny cam footage, leaked to the press, played on a continuous loop on every news channel. Her name became synonymous with deception and cruelty. The powerful friends who had applauded her just days before now tripped over themselves to publicly denounce her. Her social world vanished overnight. The legal proceedings were a formality. Faced with the irrefutable video evidence, the testimony of Mrs. Gable, the damning report from Ms. Albright, and the financial records uncovered by Marcus, Isabella's high-priced lawyers could do nothing. She was convicted on all charges and sentenced to the maximum allowable term in prison. The judge, in his sentencing, called her actions a chilling portrait of evil, masked by a veneer of civility. Justice, in the legal sense, was definitive. But for Arthur, the true resolution was not in a courtroom. It was in the quiet, steady work of building a new life for Leo. He knew that the cold, imposing walls of Blackwood Manor, with its ghosts and its solitude, was no place to raise a child. It had been his fortress, but Leo did not need a fortress. He needed a home. Arthur sold the estate and purchased a modest, light-filled house on the coast, a world away from the oppressive grandeur he had once cultivated. It was a house with large windows that looked out onto the endless expanse of the ocean, a place where the air was clean and the only sound was the rhythmic crash of waves on the shore. The transformation in both of them was profound. Arthur, the reclusive millionaire, found himself learning the simple, forgotten rhythms of a domestic life. He learned how to make pancakes, how to read a bedtime story with the right amount of dramatic flair, and how to skip stones across the water's surface. The haunted, solitary man began to fade, replaced by a patient, present father. The vast emptiness inside him, which he had tried to fill with wealth and isolation, was now being filled with a small boy's quiet presence and tentative laughter. Leo, in turn, began to heal. The constant, ambient fear that had shadowed him for so long began to recede in the warmth and safety of his new life. With the help of a kind and patient therapist, he slowly began to find his voice. The single words grew into hesitant phrases, and the phrases into full sentences. He talked about the birds he saw on the beach, the shapes he found in the clouds, and the stories he was learning to read. The nightmares that had plagued him for months began to lessen, replaced by dreams of sandcastles and sailing ships. He was still a quiet, thoughtful boy, but his silence was no longer born of terror. It was now a peaceful, contemplative quiet. One sunny afternoon, months after they had moved, Arthur was sitting on the porch, reading a book, while Leo was drawing at a small table nearby. The sea breeze was gentle, and the air was filled with the scent of salt and beach roses. Leo got up from his chair and walked over to Arthur, holding out a piece of paper. It was a new drawing. For a moment, Arthur's heart clenched, a reflexive fear of what he might see. But this drawing was different. It wasn't a picture of a locked room or a monster with sharp teeth. It was a drawing of their new house, the one by the sea. Two stick figures stood on the porch, one large and one small, holding hands. Over them, a bright, benevolent sun shone down from the corner of the page. Leo pointed to the larger figure. "Arthur," he said, his voice clear. Then he pointed to the smaller figure. "Leo, finally." He tapped the drawing of the house, looking up at Arthur with an expression of pure, uncomplicated certainty. "Home," he said. It was more than a word. It was a declaration. It was the end of one story and the beginning of another. Arthur felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so potent it almost brought tears to his eyes. He pulled the small boy into a hug, resting his chin on the top of his head. The last of the ghosts from his own past, the ghost of the one he had failed to protect, finally fell silent. He hadn't just rescued Leo. In every meaningful way, the small, silent boy who appeared at his gate on Christmas Eve had rescued him right back. The legal process for Arthur to formally adopt Leo was long, but ultimately successful. On the day the judge's decree became final, they didn't have a party. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them. They walked down to the beach at sunset, and Leo, who had become a surprisingly skilled stone skipper, found a perfectly flat, gray stone. He handed it to Arthur. "You first," he said, his smile bright and genuine. Arthur took the stone, his arm a fluid, practiced motion, and sent it skipping across the placid surface of the evening tide. It bounced 7 times before sinking into the darkening water. Leo clapped his small hands in delight. They were a family, not one born of blood, but one forged in the crucible of cruelty and kindness, of rescue and redemption. They were a testament to the fact that home is not a place you are born into, but a place you are safe in. As they stood on the shore, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon, Arthur knew that his life's purpose was no longer to acquire, but to nurture. His greatest fortune was not in his bank account, but in the small hand that had just slipped into his. True strength is not found in walls of stone or vaults of gold, but in the quiet courage to open a locked door. A door to a heart, a door to a home. The world is full of monsters who wear the faces of angels, and victims who have no voice. But sometimes a protector is listening. Sometimes a light finds its way into the darkest closet. What does it take to truly see the person right in front of you? And how many locked doors are we walking past every single day? If this story touched your heart, please share it to remind others that kindness is a choice and every child deserves a champion. Let us know in the comments about a time someone stood up for you, or a time you were able to stand up for someone else. Thank you for listening, and may you always find your safe harbor.